I was a little confused about why me, but then I was told that you get your highest approval ratings when a biracial African guy is standing next to you. So ever since you've come into office, things are really looking up. Gas is up, rent is up, food is up, everything. Not to mention, no president in my memory has given more marginalized groups opportunities. I'm talking about women, the LGBTQ community, the Taliban, the list goes on and on.
Trevor Noah was so good.
Well, and Miki, it was also great. We had a president there who wasn't a little snowflake, who could actually handle somebody telling jokes about themselves, and poking fun at the president, and being confident enough, being man enough, dare I say, to be able to laugh and smile at the jokes, which Donald Trump never was. And it was great to see that. It was, a lot of people voted for Joe Biden for a return to normalcy. The Wall Street Journal editorial page writes about that today, which I want to talk about a little bit later. But we saw that a president who not only could laugh at himself, but could praise a free press that even goes after him and attacks him every day. That's actually the difference between the United States and Russia, something that Joe Biden appreciated, something that Donald Trump most definitely did not.
And in his closing remarks, Trevor Noah got a little serious about that, about what it means to be free. It means so many different things, but it includes freedom of speech, freedom of expression. And he honed in on that. Take a look.
Every single one of you, whether you like it or not, is a bastion of democracy. And if you ever begin to doubt your responsibilities, if you ever begin to doubt how meaningful it is, look no further than what's happening in Ukraine. Look at what's happening there. Journalists are risking and even losing their lives to show the world what's really happening. You realize how amazing it is. Like, in America, you have the right to seek the truth and speak the truth, even if it makes people in power uncomfortable, even if it makes your viewers or your readers uncomfortable. You understand how amazing that is? I stood here tonight and I made fun of the President of the United States, and I'm going to be fine. I'm going to be fine, right? Do you really understand what a blessing it is? Maybe it's happened for so long that it might slip your mind. It's a blessing. In fact, here, ask yourself this question. Honestly, ask yourself this question. If Russian journalists who are losing their livelihoods, as you were talking about, Steve, and their freedom for daring to report on what their own government is doing, if they had the freedom to write any words, to show any stories, or to ask any questions, if they had basically what you have, would they be using it in the same way that you do? Ask yourself that question every day, because you have one of the most important roles in the world.
Richard Haass, it was a beautiful conclusion to that event. Again, a spirit of celebration for speech, free speech, that we haven't seen for some time. And of course, we still have problems. We have problems, with book banning in elementary schools and middle and high schools. We have problems with speech codes and illiberalism on college campuses that even college deans left of center are starting to awaken to. There are challenges from both sides, but what we saw the other night was a return to normalcy where people could get together, disagree with each other, tell jokes about each other, and still celebrate how great this country is, celebrate freedom of speech, Western democracy in a way that just was not celebrated during the Trump era. And as the Wall Street Journal said, editorial this morning, there's a reason why in a lot of places in Wisconsin, Joe Biden won by 10 points over Donald Trump, and outperformed Donald Trump by 10 points, where Republicans were winning local and congressional races because Americans were exhausted And I've got to say, anybody seeing that the other night would be like, okay, a return to normalcy and decency.
Yeah, normalcy is nice. It's reassuring. It's comforting. And I thought what Trevor Noah said, Joe, at the end was really interesting. It's a reminder that none of us should take for granted anything. And when he was talking about freedom of the press, Thomas Jefferson looking down on that dinner would have liked it. The sense of just how central it is to the functioning of any democracy. It's what holds us all accountable. And what you had there was someone reminding us of just how central it is, and a president who was comfortable, even if at times it comes at his expense. And that is what makes a democracy work. It's an acceptance of those rules. Those are the norms, and we have to accept it, even when it isn't always in our immediate self-interest. And I thought that was a special moment.
Yeah, and of course, just for anybody watching, don't be confused. I'm not talking about the event itself. I'm not a huge fan of that event. I'm not taking away from it. People who want to go certainly can go. I'm talking in general about how the president, how Republicans, how Democrats, how speakers, how Trevor Noah, how they spoke. You know, we talk about freedom of the press and the celebration of the press very early on. Jonathan Lemire, as you know better than most, Donald Trump was talking about the media being enemies of the state, using that Stalinistic term that even Khrushchev banned after Stalin died, called the press, the free press, the enemies of the state. It was an affront, not to the press. It was an affront to Western democracy, the freedom of speech, to the values that actually we see Joe Biden, Republicans, and Democrats holding up right now, and our allies in this fight in Ukraine.
Under then President Trump, it wasn't just the rhetoric about enemy of the people, but also suggested some reporters could be jailed for what they did. They were committing treason. And that's why the event Saturday night was important. And the administration wanted to have the president participate despite the COVID risks. They did want to showcase that a big event like this, if people test and are vaccinated, it could be held safely, let's hope. But also that it was an important message to send that this president, this is a return to normalcy, a break from his predecessor and how he treated the First Amendment of the press, but also to have a contrast from what we're seeing in Russia. And Trevor Noah opened his show by saying, look, if I was trying to make these jokes in Moscow, I'd be jailed. Like, that's not going to happen here. And for the president of the United States, he made that point, too, and said that we are a free people. He was a good sport, the jokes at his expense. He delivered some good zingers of his own. But the message why he wanted to be there was a celebration of democracy, of the free press. And without question, the most moving moment of the night is they ran a montage of the about nearly a dozen journalists who have been killed during covering the war in Ukraine so far, including some of our colleagues from Fox News. They ran this montage, and when it concluded, the first person out of his seat applauding was the President of the United States, applauding with real emotion in his face. You could see it. He seemed almost like he was fighting back tears. And as he stood up and clapped loudly, the rest of the room stood up too. And that's why the administration wanted to be there Saturday night.
Because a free press is so essential to American freedom, just like federal courts, which Donald Trump went after early as well. And by the way, if you think I'm overstating this, I mean, you're looking at somebody that Donald Trump accused of murder 12 times and was calling for my arrest. 12
and
times.
Security
and why?
issues.
You ask why. You ask why? Because I was critical of his COVID response. It was that simple. Like, do you think that Joe Biden, or I'll say any Republican who's thinking of running for office right now, any Republican in the Senate right now, any Republican in the House right now, well, some Republicans in the House would call for the arrest because they don't really think a whole hell of a lot about Western democracy either. But the key thing to recognize here is that what happened over the past 4 or 5 years, that was the exception, not the rule. And what is critical in the coming years is we continue to work together as a nation to make sure that that just remains a dark chapter in our history. I'm not talking about politics. I'm not talking about populism. I'm not talking about somebody's worldview on taxes or spending or any of these other issues. I'm just talking about the respect for freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and a reverence for Western democracy. A lot of people are admitting on the Trump right They're not fans of Western-style democracy.
And that must be the exception and not the rule. It was the exception and not the rule, but it needs to continue to be the exception and not the rule. It can't continue. And